Welcome and thanks for your interest in this presentation, the mediating effects of an explanatory form of reading engagement on the relationship between expressive enactment and distinct moral outcomes. The presentation is the outcome of a research project that Don Kuiken, Sean Douglas, and I have been working on for about 7 years now and presenting on. And this is kind of the newest, our newest insight from this project. I'll give you a quick overview. So first I'm going to present a series of studies and analyses that support distinctions that add conceptual nuance to the discussion of the relationship between literary reading, absorption, empathy, and changes in social cognition. That's kind of well and alive in our research field. And to do so, we adopt Kuiken and Douglas's contrast between two forms of reading engagement that was established through the ASQ, or Absorption-like States questionnaire, namely expressive enactment and integrative comprehension. I'll talk about those, of course, a little in more detail throughout the talk. And we also distinguish two forms of moral outcome: a local form of moral outcome related to racist attitudes, and then a global form of moral outcome that is more a respect for humanity as a whole, called non-utilitarian respect. And then we also disambiguate some of our previous findings. So I'm going to start with the beginning here. First, we ran a pilot study, a classroom study, where I had students of mine read the novel Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, which provides a fictional but realistic portrayal of discrimination and abuse in residential schools that Canadian governments established to, in quotation marks, civilize its Indigenous population. That's been in the news more and more over the past years, especially with the findings of the unmarked graves over the past years. Anyway, my students read this novel, and our research question that we pursued at the outset was, does reading a novel depicting effects of systemic discrimination like Richard Wagamese's Indian Horse, the discrimination of the Canadian Indigenous population, does reading that kind of a novel affect prejudices towards this population, and how might that be related to empathy? And what we found, I won't go into detail with this pilot study, but we found that yes, prejudice was reduced in a pre-post-test setup, but it was only cognitive perspective taking that positively predicted prejudice reduction. And we used Davis's interpersonal reactivity index, the IRI, to measure that in that study. And we found that the self-implicating form of empathy that Davis calls fantasy was actually negatively related to change in prejudice or prejudice reduction. So that kind of made us want to continue and look into this a bit more closely. And what we did then is we followed some of the discussions that were ongoing. So Bloom, Bracher, and others criticized that simple equation that we sometimes encounter, namely that reading increases empathy, which increases pro-social outcomes. They argue, among others, that local empathic responses can produce antipathy toward the characters and train readers in antisocial attitudes and feelings. It can also invite readers to empathize with villainous characters. There's been some studies on that, and cycles of retribution. And so what we did then, we looked at a more universal form of global attitudes, or universal human solidarity, that was measured by what we called non-utilitarian respect, and that contrasts, that is that second measure, increased non-utilitarian respect for others, our global compassion or impartial compassion outcome, and contrasted that with reduced racist attitudes, or a local outcome. And we also examined whether two forms of reading engagement established by Kuiken and Douglas that I mentioned earlier, namely expressive enactment, which reliably predicts aesthetic outcomes, and integrative comprehension, which reliably predicts explanatory outcomes, whether these different forms of reading engagement would differently predict these two forms of moral outcomes. So let's take a closer look at these two forms of reading engagement, because I'm sure they're not self-explanatory. Expressive enactment, which again has this over a series of studies, a number of studies has been established that it distinctly predicts aesthetic outcomes, is composed of three sub-dimensions or sub-scales, namely self-implicating givenness, pre-enactive empathy, and peripersonal space. And you can see some of the sample items on this slide, so if you need to, you can just pause and take a look at what's meant by self-implicating givenness, pre-enactive empathy, and peripersonal space. What you can, maybe one comment I'll make is that this form is distinctly characterized by an embodied experience, embodied reading, and the self-implicating givenness is a shared experience with a focus on the self. The pre-enactive empathy also has the self-other blending. That's distinct for this expressive enactment form of empathy, or that belongs to this. And then we've got the peripersonal space. It's what's proximal, not distant, what can be touched. You can see in the items describe it quite well. And this expressive enactment form is now, or has been distinguished from integrative comprehension. Very vaguely, and it's not an ideal fit, but we can use this distant metaphor. It would be a form of far rather than close reading, and has something of a third-person observer perspective on the events of the story. Although again, that's not a perfect fit. So you can look here. That is composed of the subscales of extrapersonal space, cognitive perspective taking, which we recognize from other studies of empathy or empathy scales, affective realism, and character realism. And here again, you can pause if you need to take a look at any of these items that belong to these scales. Okay, so in study one, following on our pilot study, we had 414 undergraduate psychology students. Again, they read the same novel, or excerpts from the same novel that the students read in the pilot study. And then they completed questionnaires on reading engagement, local moral judgment, so prejudicial attitudes, racism particularly, then global moral judgment, that was our non-utilitarian respect item. And I'm going to, here first I'll mention the materials here. We took the racism scale from Zick et al.'s group-focused enmity index, and the distinction between integrative comprehension and expressive enactment was established, as I mentioned, through Kuiken and Douglas's absorption-like states questionnaire. And non-utilitarian respect is a scale that comes from the Kuiken et al.'s experiencing questionnaire. And it in general distinguishes explanatory from aesthetic outcomes. I'm going to already, before presenting the results, present the study 2 methods and procedure, and then just go in parallel along with the findings. So in the second study, it was the design was exactly the same, except we used a text that was unrelated to the Canadian Indigenous population. It was also unrelated to prejudice or racism. We used excerpts from a novel On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan that thematizes, among other things, inter and intrapersonal consequences of the willingness or inability to jump over one's own shadow and humbly work toward meaningful relationships. So you can see quite a different text, and we wanted to see to what degree these different forms of reading engagement then can still predict these different forms of moral outcome, even if the text is not directly related to, let's say, racism, for example. And here you can see 44 undergraduate students, and so on. And the rest is identical to study 1. Okay, let's look at the results here. In study 1, we, and using a structural equation model, we found that expressive enactment, when statistically controlled for integrative comprehension, predicts non-utilitarian respect, which again is our measure of a form of global moral attitude or universal human solidarity. And you can see the path here involves open reflection, because these are both both expressive enactment and integrative comprehension are forms of absorbed and openly reflective absorbed reading experiences, but different types of openly reflective absorbed reading experiences. And integrative comprehension, let's go back to the first one. So expressive enactment, you see here, when statistically controlled for integrative comprehension. So we've got the statistical control here. Predicts non-utilitarian respect, and you see the size of that right here. Let me see if I can highlight this for you. I should be able to here, and that is a significant beta value here. And then integrative comprehension, when statistically controlled for expressive enactment, here's that statistical control again, also predicts non-utilitarian respect, and this is also significant result right here. 0.24 for this path and so on. Okay, so these are, again, just to be sure, to be clear, these are the results when we statistically control for the covariance between expressive enactment and integrative comprehension. That's that double-sided arrow path. And only the first path of these two, namely open reflection, expressive enactment to non-utilitarian respect, is replicated in study 2. Actually with a higher beta value and a higher significance. And that leaves us with some ambiguity regarding the relationship between integrative comprehension and non-utilitarian respect. And that's one of the aspects we wanted to address in further analyses that I'll present right now. So what we did is we looked at the paths from expressive enactment to non-utilitarian respect. So here, first of all, open reflection, then to expressive enactment, directly to, open reflection, expressive enactment, directly to non-utilitarian respect. So once directly and once with integrative comprehension as a mediator. And what that did, it allowed us to disambiguate those previous results. Remember that both expressive enactment and integrative comprehension predicted non-utilitarian respect in the model we just looked at before. And as you can see here, we found that expressive enactment strongly, directly predicts non-utilitarian respect, and that's highly significant, or very highly significant result, beta value. And whereas the relationship, this relationship disappears with integrative comprehension as a mediator. So that's a non-significant beta value here, the 0.12. And that indicates that expressive enactment, independently from integrative comprehension, is the driver of non-utilitarian respects. And these results with this mediating model are consistently replicated across study 2. Now, we've got confidence in that direct relationship between expressive enactment and non-utilitarian respect, but there was some ambiguity regarding the relationship between integrative comprehension and non-utilitarian respect. And that confidence that we had in the direct relationship between expressive enactment and non-utilitarian respect is supported by our mediating model that includes both the direct relationship and the mediated relationship between expressive enactment and non-utilitarian respect. And that is so even when integrative comprehension is decomposed into its constituents, as we can see here. Right? So we see that even when integrative comprehension within that model is decomposed, that direct relationship persists. Now, cognitive perspective taking seems to be the only positive predictor of non-utilitarian respect in the path from open reflection to expressive enactment through integrative comprehension as a mediator, and then non-utilitarian respect as the outcome variable, as indicated by this very highly significant 0.19 beta here. But this result is not replicated in study 2, as we can see right here. So again, here the direct relationship is there even when integrative comprehension within that mediating model is decomposed into its coefficients. But you see here that this cognitive perspective taking relationship disappears. So that's not there anymore. Okay, so what our mediating model and decomposition of it allowed us to replicate, allowed us to do is to replicate and then disambiguate evidence that openly reflective expressive enactment, but not integrative comprehension, facilitates global respect for human subjectivity as measured by our non-utilitarian respect measure. So let's take a look at the local moral attitudes now, namely what we what we measured through the racist attitudes. So looking at the same analyses that we just looked at and the same steps in the analyses that we just looked at for non-utilitarian respect, we can see that when we look at this for racist attitudes, we found a path leading from open reflection to expressive enactment, and that this path from open reflection to expressive enactment predicts less change in racist attitudes, local moral outcomes here. And so what that means is that higher racism scores or lower change scores that it predicted higher racism scores or lower change scores from a pre to a post test. And this is a significant result. And we also found that the path leading from open reflection to integrative comprehension predicts increased change in racist attitudes, namely that so lower racism scores or higher change scores, and that this 0.38 was highly significant here. And again, these are results that these are the results when we were statistically controlling for the covariance, here the 0.59, the double-sided arrow path here between the covariance between expressive enactment and integrative comprehension. And these results were replicated in study 2, using that on Chesil Beach excerpt, and they were even a bit accentuated in their beta values and in their significances. Okay. And then here again, we wanted to look at the model that we used to disambiguate the first study. And when we applied our mediating variable model, we found that the path leading from open reflection here to expressive enactment, and from there through integrative comprehension as a mediator to racist attitudes, so the local moral outcome, maintain the structure of the relationship between the forms of reading engagement and racist attitudes that we observed in the initial analysis. That is, and we saw that expressive enactment directly predicted the racist attitudes, and the converse when integrative comprehension functions as a mediator. So, and this was, these were both highly significant results right here. So that pattern replicates the model that we saw. I'm going to go back to show you if I can. Oh, I can't. Okay. And again, study 2. In study 2, the expressive enactment model predicts racist attitudes, and integrative comprehension predicts less racist attitudes. So in both of these studies, these findings were there. Study 2 replicated these findings. And then remember the findings of our pilot study where we saw that only cognitive perspective taking positively predicted prejudice reduction, and that the Davis's self-implicating form of empathy, that fantasy scale from Davis, was negatively related to change in prejudice, and we wanted to disambiguate that a bit further. So we looked at the respective contributions of individual components of integrative comprehension to the relationships observed in our model above, integrative comprehension pieces here. And what we found was that cognitive perspective taking and affective realism, so these two that are already highlighted in red here, were the main drivers of the relationship between integrative comprehension and lower racist attitudes. Extrapersonal space and character realism were not consistently significant. And this was replicated in study 2, as you can see here. Right, no surprises there. exactly replicated again. All right, so in summary then, we replicated and disambiguated evidence that openly reflective expressive enactment, but not integrative comprehension, facilitates global respect for human subjectivity. We found that cognitive perspective taking and affective realisms are the components of integrative comprehension that make a modest contribution to the prediction of lower racist attitudes. And the results substantiate not only the distinction between expressive enactment and integrative comprehension, but also the distinction between the local and global forms of moral change that may be outcomes of those deeply engaged literary forms of literary reading. And we saw that we have forms of empathy at play in both integrative comprehension and in expressive enactment, but our data suggests that we need to differentiate these forms of reading engagement and the kinds of empathy that they comprise because they have different consequences. Thank you very much.